Hi, everyone. Okay. Hey, so my name is Jenny, and you might know me as QDork on Twitter and Instagram, and I'm going to briefly talk about some of the games that I've made and worked on. So I did the art for Slam City Oracles, which is a game that I worked on with Jane Friedoff for No Quarter 2014. Later on, I made this game with AP Thomson, also known as Bad Tetris on Twitter, and it's called Stellar Smooch. It's about kissing and loneliness in space. If you're interested, it's on the App Store for free. We also worked on another game together called Beglitched, and that one is about insecurity in our computers and ourselves. It's currently out on Steam and the App Store, so please check it out if you're interested. And currently, I'm making a personal game about dieting called Consume Me. Anyway, today I'm going to talk to you about prototyping. So I'm going to tell you how the way I prototype is different from the way many people prototype. I'm going to walk you through the process I developed step by step, and I'm going to show you what's in common structure-wise and then content-wise with all my prototypes. I will give you the pros and cons of this prototyping method, and then I will provide you with some solutions that help me along the way. So first of all, what do you normally think of when we think of game prototype? So in general, we might come up with something in our heads like this. Here's a prototype that I think many people are familiar with. It's very stripped down, with no focus on art or polish. I think the emphasis is placed on the mechanics and gameplay. It doesn't really look like a game yet. It only loosely resembles one. And we kind of need to use our imagination to fill this empty space in order to turn it into a game. And I'm going to show you that my prototyping style is pretty much the opposite. Since I come from a visual background, I started making art for games, I tend to think about working with visuals first and then allowing that to drive the design process of these prototypes. I'm going to use 20 of my prototypes as examples in my talk today. So you might ask me, how did I start prototyping and making all these small games? So actually, in spring 2015, I took a class taught by Bennett Foddy called Prototyping Studio. In that class, each student creates one game a week based off of a specific prompt. When I got to class, I had very basic programming knowledge, and I sort of made a couple things by myself, but I never really had the experience of working alone and producing a game within a single week. So the notion of making 12 or 13 games in a single semester was really daunting. So the first prototype that I made in this class was based off the prompt sink or swim. So in this game, you gotta mash the keyboard to tread water. It's easy to desync your movements, and once you do, it's very hard to not drown. The game is over once the character sinks past the bottom of the screen. That's briefly how you'd play it. I like this prototype. I think it's silly, it gets to the point really fast, and it was pretty easy to create. The prototype also captures a lot of how I began to shape my prototyping process after this point. So I'm going to show you a breakdown of how I made this prototype. I sort of use the same method over and over again in my later prototypes, and I just kind of refine and iterate on this process. So since the prompt was sink or swim, drowning instantly came to mind. During this brainstorming period, I was thinking of the sort of game I wanted to create. Since the notion of drowning kept pushing forth the ideas of keeping afloat, it led me to Google diagrams of treading water. I was looking at the egg beater kick and how it's divided into like four scenarios. And that sort of led to me developing the movement in this sort of prototype. So after I studied these diagrams for a while, I decided to make a GIF in Photoshop because I thought it was funny, and I believed I could make some sort of game using this art that I created. So I'm going to give you a very technical breakdown of how I do this. I work in Photoshop, so I have an image in my mind, and I draw it out. I put each asset in its own layer, and then I label each layer individually and very precisely to know what I'm going to program in later. Then I save each layer as its own art asset, and I drag it into Unity, and then I combine it into the scene by dragging all the elements in. If you look to the left, you'll see that I order them and create the character there in like a very precise and mannered form. And then I put everything in one big script. So I tend to just create one big game manager script to handle all of my interaction. I tend to avoid splitting up my code because I think that calling functions from multiple scripts can get really messy really quickly. And because I'm not technically oriented and I just want to get my point across, it's just easier for me to do it in this way. And then I drag all my art assets into Unity and basically code in the interaction for the prototype. So yeah, that is like a very technical breakdown of like how I kind of go through this process with art first and then coding and interaction second. Once I've coded that in, I need to figure out some way to have the game end. So in this case, it's when the character reaches the bottom of the screen. And yeah, then at the very end, I add in text, sound effects, and visual polish whenever I can think of that kind of stuff. So I'm going to quickly walk through a bunch of my prototypes and show you how this method recurs over and over again. So the theme for this week was sickness, and I used it as an opportunity to prototype a bunch of these interstitials and vignettes that would later make up the majority of Consume Me. So here's some of the game. You kind of start with a diary entry. And then you come to the scene where you're trying to decide what Jenny is going to eat for a meal. And I wanted to explore this mechanic of just like seeing dieting as like very restrictive and looking at food not as food. So it has like a very puzzly feel to it. And then once after you play around with the pieces on the screen, you'll be led into a sequence of vignettes like this. Anyway, so I think the most important thing I learned about that prototype were these sequences. And like the sink or swim prototype, all of them were based around this idea of having a screenshot in my head and then figuring out a way to introduce interaction through that. So if you see this, this was drawn in Photoshop and then broken down into art assets. Likewise, with this scene, it also follows a similar pattern. And so is this one. I also made another game for this prompt, which was trying. So I made a 2-player game about eating or being eaten. And as you can see here, it's maybe the only 3D game that I made. And I'll tell you why that I don't tend to make 3D games. Yeah, so one player is the octopus and the other person is the arm. And the arm is trying to stab the octopus while the octopus is trying to collect all the pieces of wasabi on the screen. So there's a reason for why it's the only 3D game out of this collection. And it's because 3D can get complicated. It definitely takes more time to create the art assets. So for example, with this octopus, I had to model, rig, and animate it, and it definitely took longer than taking a couple of minutes to draw like a 2D sprite. And then importing it into Unity can also be a hassle, because sometimes I'll get something like this. Anyway, later on I made a 2D version of this game, and it kind of, keeps to the same visual aesthetic that I continued developing on. And, just look at these art assets. There aren't a ton of them, and it's just like very easy to produce quickly and get to the point with your prototype. I also made a game about doing bicycle crunches. Once again, it's just another example to reinforce this idea of, simple, to-the-point mechanics. It's just really goofy, there's a lot of tension there, and it's very easy to understand when I show it to people. And once again, it's also a game about pose matching, So here are just some of the poses that I brought in Photoshop. And you can see that I distilled it into sprites, which I later coded into Unity. 10 seconds was another prompt, and you might know the game that came out of this one. So in this one, you have 10 seconds to do Jenny's makeup. And it was inspired by my real-life experience of getting up too late and not having enough time to get ready in the morning. Yeah, so it's just not that many assets. Shapeshift is another one that you might have seen before. This was made for Ludum Dare, and the theme was shapeshift, so I made a game about doing yoga, and it's very co-op-like, and you're supposed to match the poses in the background. Yeah. So anyway, these are just a bunch of technical aspects that my games share and have in common. They all share a similar color palette. I reuse the same sound effects over and over again because I don't want to re-record or find stuff again on freesounds.org. I use the same dimensions. I primarily use a mouse to do the art. I have one big game manager script that I code in all the interaction with. And I'd say those are the structural things that these prototypes have in common. However, they also have a lot in common when exploring personal subject matter. With some of them that I'm showing you so far, a lot of them have to do with daily life activities and routine, but I also talk about more personal aspects to my life that I feel like is more challenging to share. So this one, the theme for that week was reprehensible. And it was a custom theme that my professor gave to me because I think he felt like I had a tendency to play it safe and make very cute games. So it was definitely a challenge to think of what sort of game I wanted to make with this one. But this is what I came up with. So yeah, I'm sorry if it's too visually grotesque. But basically, you are trying to get the character in the game to purge. And she can only move to the next screen if she does this successfully. And I feel like it's a really interesting dynamic to explore because that's what games are good at. They're good at rewarding players to perform bad behavior, And we see that so much in in games that have violence, but why don't we explore this sort of violence? Yeah, so once you get past that screen, you get a scene where Jenny is looking in the mirror and critiquing herself, and it's something that I guess is drawn from my personal experience when I was in high school and just very unhappy with the way it looked. Simulacrum was the final theme for that class. If you don't know what it means, basically a simulacrum is an image or a representation of someone or something. And it's also used to describe this substitute or this imitation that isn't super satisfactory. So I actually, for that prompt, I made a game about long-distance relationships and Skype. So I was in one at the time when I was making this, and I felt very conflicted about that experience because in some sense, it was really satisfying to have my relationship be very contained and, this part of my life that I could keep away from affecting everything else. But in another sense, it was also, it felt like just this likeness of what a real relationship is. So in this game, the player is Skyping with me and pretending to go on a date with me. And a lot of the dialogue here is just drawn from personal experience of, I guess, the awkwardness and kind of the repetitive conversations I had with the person I was dating at the time. But I guess, I feel like these kind of subject matters are things that I would talk to my close friends about. And that is one of the motivations for why I make personal games, because I think it's a great way to be intimate with the player and share stuff about myself that maybe I wouldn't necessarily want to talk to you in the street about or something. Dress Up is a prompt that I came up with by myself because I wanted to continue exploring these themes of body image. In this game, it's kind of like a take on Dress Up, but the mirror kind of gives you feedback on the internal state of how the character feels when she tries on different pieces of clothing. This one isn't so much of a game as really just, exploring different thoughts and feelings and responsiveness that I want to test out. So I feel like with these prototypes, they shift from small mini games that have score and have win or loss states to games that are exploring more about mood and internal states and thought and narrative. And this one also had a lot of art assets. I also made this prototype. It's not really a prototype, but it was for Flat Jam, which happened in January. And I included this game here because it also covers this personal experience that I had. And I guess, a quick thing to mention here was I ended up in the hospital for New Year's Eve 2016, and I made a twine about it. And I wrote down the conversation that my friend had with me over the phone, and I was thinking oh, how am I going to make something out of this? Because I felt like it was something I wanted to get out and talk about. And when the opportunity came up, I ended up turning that passage and all those words into a game, which this is some of the structural stuff that I implemented here. But yeah, it's all based on personal experience, and I think it's just a great way to, kind of deliver this to, people who are interested in this kind of subject. Oops. Anyway, so as you can see so far, all my prototypes share a common aesthetic, both in terms of form and content. And I'm going to tell you the strengths and weaknesses of my prototyping method. So this method's strengths include it gets across the point really quickly because you have a prompt in mind and you have this one idea that you're making something about. So there isn't really room to get confused about what you're making. I think that's a really good point. It also creates a compelling and distinct style. It's robust, easily identifiable. If you post GIFs of this kind of stuff on Twitter, people will know that it's your style because, you've defined it as your own. It's efficient. When you generate things in this method, you can do things very quickly. You're basically developing a template when you're making this sort of prototype. And it's also a lot of fun. It doesn't get boring because you're always making something new within this short period of time. So you don't ever encounter, the growing pains of developing a larger game. However, there are also limitations which I think you should be aware of when you're interested in using this type of prototyping method. So the first thing that I came across is, even though this process is a lot of fun and exciting, it can also be extremely distracting. So when I was making these small vignettes for Consume Me, I ended up being drawn to develop more mechanics and more vignettes instead of focusing on larger design problems that I ended up having to deal with. Another aspect that I kind of felt about these smaller games is that it kind of felt gimmicky. It felt shallow. There was no substance to it. At my worst point, I was thinking, maybe these games are entertaining for about 30 seconds to 5 minutes. I didn't feel like my prototypes had the sort of depth that a lot of games have. And also, this process of being super methodical and streamlined approach turns out to be sort of restrictive. I didn't feel like I had to experiment after a certain point since I was creating this template which allowed me to generate content very quickly. It was almost this mindless process, and in a way, it's sort of this double-edged sword where you create this efficient method of putting out work. On one hand, you don't have to reinvent the wheel each time, but on the other hand, you can get kind of lazy and fall into routines of developing the sort of content that fits within that framework. And so I kind of hit a big problem around this point. I felt like as I was developing Consume Me, since the game is focused around dieting and eating, I felt like there was no core mechanic, and I needed one for this game to be good. So I, took this process of taking a prompt and making a small game out of it to approach solving this problem of what is the main mechanic. So as you saw earlier, I was telling you a little bit about this one where you're basically taking pieces of food and sliding them into a plate to remain under calorie target. And I felt like this game was interesting for maybe the first 10 minutes. Conceptually, it's a cool way to explore dieting. However, when I wanted to develop it and expand it into like a larger prototype, I felt like it got boring really fast. So I was thinking, if anyone knows this game, Steven Sausage Roll, the types of puzzles in this game are very mechanical, but there is a very large design space that I was, hoping that my game and my prototyping process would allow me to explore. But unfortunately, I felt so frustrated with it that I ended up just kind of abandoning that prototype and moving to the next one. So in this one, I felt like the way to solve my problem of, developing this core mechanic for eating was to take it from a cerebral puzzle game to something silly and, playful and physics-based. So I was thinking, it'd be cool to make a game centered around, literally balancing your diet. And even though this produced great GIFs on Twitter, it was not fun after, 2 minutes, because once you're placing food on the plate, it doesn't get any more deep or exciting than that. I don't know. I kept on trying, thinking this method is going to help me arrive at the core mechanic that I really want to get at. So, after getting feedback from other people, I got this one piece of feedback, which was, I don't feel like any of the pieces of food in your game have any kind of difference. They're all just calories. Maybe you should explore, playing with different types of food and how the player responds differently. So I made this game, which also, falls into the framework of it's visually captivating, it's exciting for the first 30 seconds, but there's very little design space to explore past that. And, around this time, I was getting help from my friends, from people that I've worked with, my collaborators. AP was suggesting, maybe you can focus on the design instead of the art. Try something different with your method, with your style of prototyping. So I took that mechanic and kind of went down the traditional route of making games. I didn't focus on the art at all and just focused on level design. And so I started, taking that mechanic and exploring it a bit more. But the whole time, I really did not like doing this. It was painful because it was not what I was good at, what I felt comfortable doing. And actually, to be honest, I ended up I abandoned this prototype as well. And I just felt really discouraged and kind of depressed. I eventually realized that maybe the core mechanic of dieting wasn't really the problem here. I was focusing on the wrong problem. Instead, I felt like, I need to value the stuff that I've created because they are good. So with the help of others and just with a lot of time, I finally reached this realization that maybe the problem is I needed to find a framework to fit all these prototypes instead of just focusing on trying to find that one core mechanic. And it took a lot of time to reevaluate and come to this conclusion. It wasn't just overnight. So now that I finally identified that problem, I decided to focus on this other issue, which was, I need to find a framework for my games. So I'm going to bring you through another set of prototypes that are very different from the ones I mentioned earlier. As you can see, this prototype is extremely different because there is no focus on art or anything. It's all about just playing with the system that Jenny is, going through her day and doing activities. And then I kind of iterated on that idea of performing activities in this order, but I still didn't feel entirely satisfied with it. So I kept on, thinking of a way to fit in these interstitials and vignettes and figuring out a way to make them a cohesive whole. So I don't know, I was pretty playful with this. I tried out creating a little world where you interact with items and then have an action or an activity occur through that interaction because I was playing Animal Crossing at the time and I really liked this idea of having little mini games tied to your tools. And I also tried this one out, which was like another prototype purely focused on stats. And all this was uncomfortable because it was not playing to my strengths and what I was used to, but it was really important to like go through that process of doing uncomfortable stuff because I had a problem to fix. I didn't know the framework that I was going to use. As you can see, none of these were really successful. And eventually, the way I realized my solution to the problem was actually to not make a game at all. So for my second to last prototype that I want to show to you, I actually ended up making a comic. And a big problem that I had with my game was not really seeing what the entirety of the game was. And that was not allowing me to progress further and develop more of it because, I felt aimless and in the dark. So I spent maybe a week or two just developing the story for the game. And it felt very hard to not want to turn this into like some loose system or loose mechanical thing. But I think it was very worth it and necessary for me to go about continuing prototyping and exploring the design of this game. Which leads me to my current framework. So I'm going to explain a little bit of it. Currently, there are these panels that you slide in to the slots, and each panel eventually will take you to a vignette or part of the story or a mini game. And I feel like that is really the design that I've settled on for Consume Me. And this is just kind of like a layout of that. If you have more questions about it, I'd be happy to answer that later. Anyway, so I'm just going to wrap this up and tell you the big takeaways that I have for you. Creating a prototyping method is extremely useful, but work with your strengths. Do what you're good at. Feel free to make a billion prototypes with that because I think it's really valuable and a great experience to do. However, you want to be aware of the limitations of this prototyping method you've developed. And you also want to know the problems that you're trying to solve. The thing is, you might not know the problems before you start making it and coming up with problems. So I guess that advice leads to question the method, not just the work you've produced with this method. Sometimes, I guess, I'm not going to know what problems you're going to encounter, but the thing with me is I was too focused on looking at all the stuff I created using this prototyping method, whereas I really needed to be questioning the method itself. And finally, I would say that let people in on your creative process, get feedback from them. If you're only working in a little bubble, it's hard to really know what you're doing. So I got a lot of help from professors, from my peers, from my collaborators who, gave me feedback. And, I think with this final piece of advice, sometimes it's okay to shut yourself out and don't let anyone into your process. Sometimes you need to have time to figure out what you're making. But I think eventually it's really crucial to let people in and let people give you feedback and accept that. So that's my talk. Thank you so much for coming and listening. And if you want to follow me on Twitter or check out my website, it's at QDork. So hope you enjoy Amaze. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. You mentioned that your preferred method of prototyping is taking a screenshot and then turning that into a game.
Right.
Have you considered paper prototyping, where you explore the gameplay mechanics before you do the art?
Definitely. I've done a lot of paper prototyping as well. I didn't include a lot of that, but that is definitely part of my process. Yeah. So do I reuse aspects of my prototype that are only in the prototype, like code and stuff? Yeah, definitely. I definitely reuse elements of scripts that, sometimes I'll have a timer function that I'll reuse again, or screen shake, or just these elements. Yeah. Not really. I just stick to the same color palette generally. And a lot of it is just like creating rules in my head that I'll always stick to. You know, like, oh, I'm gonna make a canvas that is 240 by 360 pixels, and I'm always gonna be doing that. So it's just little rules that help me kind of mindlessly make those decisions for myself. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Right. Right. I think that hits at, you know, how this process can get super restrictive. You know, I like want to make progress towards something. So I felt the need to continue always exploring this theme because I felt like, oh, maybe more stuff will come out if I just focus on this idea of body image and dieting. Sometimes I will, but I think that in my head, because I want to make progress, I end up playing it more safe. But yeah. There's more time if you want to ask me more questions. Yeah. All right, well, I always loved to draw, but I never felt like I could pursue that professionally. So I had a Tumblr where I would post doodles and things. And I was doing that and also being pre-med, but also failing at that. So it was kind of this weird, long path of figuring out what I wanted to do, but always loving to do art for fun. Yeah. Yeah.
So you said that you tend to program everything in one file.
Yes.
Do you think that's a restriction that even more technical people should possibly try out with just so you can possibly learn new ways of working?
So I actually heard that piece of advice from my friend who said that Jonathan Blow recommended to have everything in one file and then split it up into different functions later because optimizing too early can be restrictive and sometimes the focus shouldn't be about optimization. It should just be about getting down the idea. So I guess, you know, try that out if you want to do that. Yeah. Because of just ease, you know, sometimes I don't like carrying my tablet with me everywhere I go. So, you know, I'm kind of lazy and that's why I developed these rules. I developed like a color palette I stick to because I know it'll look good. And I think with the mouse, it was also like a similar reason. It's just like, oh, I don't want to carry my tablet around and it's just not always reliable. So, you know, sticking to something that I can do quickly is why I decided to work with a mouse. For example, yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. I think personal games have share a lot of similarities to journaling and to writing personal stuff because it's just a way to like process my emotions and feelings. And likewise, you know, I was describing how when I'm making a personal game and when I'm sharing it with like an audience, it feels like I'm talking to a close friend and letting them in on my world and like my little secret. So I kind of get the joy out of that sort of interaction. Yeah. Sorry, could you repeat that one more time? The thing is, I'm probably my worst critic because I think a lot of people are very tentative to say negative things to me, especially since the topic is personal. So I've kind of developed this, you know, this like coping mechanism of, oh, well, since no one is going to really tell me how they feel about my personal game, I've got to be the most critical person. And I think that's a really challenging thing to develop that can go into the wrong direction. So I think actually getting feedback from other people will bring you back to reality and make you realize that you're making good stuff. Because my tendency is actually getting too negative and not being able to see anything good. And I think it's not even just with personal games. It extends to any kind of creative and artistic work where the creator is the worst critic of their own work. Yeah. That's a great idea. I have not thought about that because I guess I wasn't even expecting to share this much of my process, but I will definitely consider it. I would like to talk more about it and go in depth with it. Thanks for the suggestion. Yeah. What is the question? What? Could you repeat that one more time? Sorry, yeah. I guess the reason is because I have this idea of finishing Consume Me as entirety, so I see all these as leading up to that, even though I present it in a very finalized form. I guess personally I see it as, oh, they're not done yet. Yeah. Very good. We have 2 more minutes if you want to ask me other questions. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah.
So you said you were doing 1 game a week. Do you usually tend to allocate a large block of time to work on the game right away, or do you spend a few hours every day and you reflect in between, or does that vary?
I think based off of my personality type and the way I like making things, I tend to get very sucked into something, and I just want to spend all my time working on it because it's just this pleasurable experience of making games. Ideally, I'd like to work out a routine where I work on something on a more consistent basis, but that's definitely challenging for me. So a lot of these prototypes were made with this, I just want to make it and create it, which is not always reliable because you can get burned out doing that kind of thing. One more question? No. Good. Yeah.
How much time does it actually take for you to make one of the prototypes? Because you said you made 1 game a week, so how many hours do you actually spend on those games?
I want to say usually it doesn't take a week. Usually it takes around 4 days of full-time work, I would say, or more than that. Sometimes I'll just spend all day thinking about it and figuring out what to implement and just kind of doing that. So maybe 24 hours completely, but spread out through the course of 3 to 4 days. Yeah. Is that it? I guess you're good. Yeah, thank you so much for coming to my talk.